The subject car that we are looking at is a pre-production Austin Healey 104. And we're just going to do some footage to document some of its peculiarities. Notice here that all the firewall to outer shroud screws are a flathead screw. They are not Phillips. We can see here that 2 are flathead, 2 are Phillips. I don't know as if this is original or not. It just strikes me out as that they'd be different. There'd be a consistency. I would suspect the Phillips had been changed. There are 2 holes in the side of the shroud by the hood opening, and these appear to be have been put in there originally. I suspect it's strapped to hold down the hood during its racing history. See here the other holes drilled for the hood straps as well. In its history, we can see here that the air vents had been filled in with body fill. I presume that was done by someone after the car was produced. And all the screw holes and rivet holes on the top of the dash that have your washer jet or any screws that hold the front shroud down seem to be filled in. These holes, the 1, 2, 3 holes, are the holes used to hold the heater vents down. They've been filled in by either an aluminum weld or aluminum type body filler. I haven't had a chance to dig that out to examine it yet. Okay, the rear part of the front bulkhead appears to attach with some 3/16 small head rivets. You can see the screw holes for the surround. There seems to be a quantity of 5 that hold that down. Difficult to see in this shot, but there are 2 rivets that go down the side of the front shroud in the door jamb area. These appear to be a blind aircraft rivet, and they've been smoothed out. On the other side of the car, it's been filled in and then shaved. The rivets are there if you feel on the inside. Not sure which side is correct. This is the left side of the front shroud, and here we can see that the rivets don't appear visible on the outside of this panel, but they're definitely in there. I suspect this was filled in after they were installed. On the driver's left rear fender, we can see here again they've used an aircraft rivet. Unlike the right side that has been pop riveted, I would suspect that this is the way it was fastened to originally. On the rear shroud again, they've used a 3/16 small head rivet to do the back. There appears to be 9. The front shroud, where they have the filler panel in behind the grill, that appears to be riveted in with a 1/8 inch common type rivet. I would suspect that this panel has probably been changed. I'll know more when I take this apart. It very well may be an aircraft rivet that goes in there. It would appear as though, in the fashion that we've received the car, that the front valance was not in place or had been used on it. The holes appear to be filled in, and we can see in this shot here how there has been a repair where the shroud meets the bottom of the chassis and attaches to it, where it's been repaired as well. This is fairly common. This is not unfamiliar with what we see. The hole in the bottom center I don't believe is authentic. You can see here on the left side of the car, again, it's been all pop riveted together. Make note in the grille surround mouth, there are two holes drilled in the panels going down from the side, one on each side, the other one there. Not quite sure what that's all about yet. 4 holes in the bottom are to locate the lower part of the grille. That's normal and correct. It doesn't appear as though the front fenders have been repaired yet, but the lower part of the fender does not seem to have the same roundness as the later style fenders. Notice the corner of the fender is a little sharper, and it doesn't have a tendency to swoop down as the later cars did. The inside of the front fender is fastened down 1, 2, 3, 4 flathead slotted type screws. There are no screws in the top upper part of the arch of the fender. We'll notice that there are 5 hinge bolts per hinge as well. They as well had a flat slotted screw head on them. Here's a shot of the right rear fender. We can see that it's taken a substantial hit and has been repaired. The rest of the fender appears not to be too bad, except of course front dog legs, and that's very, very common on these. The cutouts on the rear shroud don't appear to be as clean and as rounded out as the later model cars. These seem to have been just cut out very quickly so that you could slide the bumper brackets through. They haven't been trimmed or radiused at all. There doesn't appear to be any damage in this panel. There also appears to be no consistency in the manner in which this was done. Once I get this panel off and stripped on the inside, we should be able to determine if that has in fact been repaired and just not returned back to the way it was. The rear lower part of the trunk, or rear surround, has 11 blind rivets or aircraft rivets in it. I believe the later models had 13. And then there will be 3 holes for the buffer rubbers that stop the trunk lid from hitting the bottom panel. You can see the damage in here. The car's definitely been hit at the back at some degree. This is the forward part of the rear shroud. It is held on in the trunk area with only 2 flathead slotted screws. I believe they're 1/4 inch fine thread. Much larger than the originals were. I would suspect through its race history they've mounted the battery in the back of the car for easier access. We can see here that the cable was just brought through. The hole wasn't punched out clean or anything. It was just brought through very quickly to do the job. Again, it would appear as though the wiring harness is just tape wrapped. This is a quick shot of the engine bay. The Ford starter solenoid is definitely not original, and I would suspect we're going to get rid of that. You can see here the chassis identification tag on this car, and here is the other tag, chassis again. There doesn't appear to be the other type of tag that has been used on the Healey's to identify them as per the model number, and that. This seems to be the only identification that I see at the present time. Front shroud. The other hundreds had 5 screws holding down that panel to the shroud. This model here only shows 3. There's the 2 flathead screws again holding the hood return spring for the hood catch. The front section of the front shroud is held on only by 3 flathead screws. Okay, we're to the bottom of the car now. I've just put this thing up on a hoist. See, the dual exhaust is actually a single pipe with a second connection added to it. This is a shot of the rear shocks that they used. These are much different than the original shocks. Okay, here's a shot of the rear end. You can see on the left side of the pitch of the drain plug at the bottom, and the level plug is halfway up. Shot of the brake booster, of the brake master cylinder. No, this is a shot of the clutch master cylinder. Originally it had a mechanical clutch, and now it was changed over to a hydraulic system. It had a BN4 transmission, I believe is what Blair said. Here's the setup they used. Shot of the X-member. You can see here it's kind of difficult to see, but the X-member's been all cut up to accommodate the other style transmission. We can see the disc brakes assemblies added to the 104. I presume this was done probably during its racing history. It's a shot of the typical front end cross member. These are always crushed in like that. Chassis seemed a little bit weak up in that area as well, which is pretty normal. Here's the pedal assembly. And the shot of the forward part of the exhaust. We have the master cylinder for the brakes. And the brake rod. We have a shot of the taped wiring harness screwing down to the front of the front cross member. Here's a shot of the front filler pan. It's hard to see here, but it is riveted to that front tower brace. Here's a shot of the right side of the car. See a bit of rot decay in that right front and rear. We notice here that the front wheel arch is at the very bottom on the later cars. That was rolled or just left straight. These here are clearly bent to a 90-degree flap at the bottom. And then we're going to finish stripping out the bottom of the car, getting it ready to go over to the sandblasters. Now I want to get a clear shot of this here. We have the spring coming across and going to the clutch master cylinder. We have the cable wire coming across. Along the chassis. Right. Then it goes up to the top to the inner fender well. Good. Out of the throttle linkage assembly. Starts off at the bottom where the pedal is and carries all the way up to the top and then over to the carburetors. The shot of the dimmer switch. Okay, now we've got here the front superstructure. We can see here that there's very little webbing and bracing up through here. On the later models that was filled in a little more and there were stamp panels put in. Rear structure, we can see that this bracket that holds the rear shroud on, and generally that is a filler or fully molded in panel. On this car it's not. There would appear to be no stampings whatsoever in the rear bulkhead. Generally they have large D-type stampings and they just don't exist. And I don't believe that this area has been repaired at all. We can see the battery box again. I think that's an aftermarket or an after production installation. See here the piece of plywood stripped across the back. I don't think this is original, but it was certainly there when we took the car apart. I notice here in the door or body gussets that they have lightning holes in them. I don't believe that that was carried on. You can see here the one-piece front wheel arches, which was later changed over to two-piece, an inner and an outer. Here is the right side of the front idler arm tower. We can see here that there's two sets of holes drilled for the idler arm. On the right side, the idler arm bolts go through the upper holes in this bracket. Later cars, there was only one set of holes put in. Now when going to the steering box side, we can see that the holes are mounted in the lower section of that bracket. I'm not quite sure as to why they did this, but it's this is something or a practice that wasn't done on later cars. We can see here that an aluminum spacer block was used for the front shock rebound rubber Once that rubber breaks, what happens is the shock drops considerably lower than it should, and the end result that we can see that the lower part of the spindle now jams into the lower A-arms. Later on, in later years and later models, this was changed and a shock plate installed to I think help prevent this and make mounting of the shock easier. We also can see here that there is an aluminum shim plate used between the shock and the upper spring tower. This here is something that was not continued with in later years. Okay, now that we have the shock taken off the top spring tower, we can see that the base of the shock is painted in a blue. Here is the spacer that was used to shim the shock height from the shock tower. During our examination, we can see here that the other spacer plate used in the tower is welded down to the spring tower. This plate holds the spacer in position. Okay, we can see this is the left tower. See here the spacer block used for the rubber stop. Now this rubber stop spacer was not on the right hand side. I suspect it should have been. As well, on the left tower, the two PEM nuts that sit towards the inner part of the tower are broken away and not there. Okay, here's a shot of the floor pan. This is the right side that we took out of the Austin Healey. When observing this, you'll notice that it's not a D-stamping in the floor pan. In fact, it's more of a square with radiused corners. You'll also notice that the squares taper as the floor pan does. It tapers with the floor pan. That is the original pattern used on the 104 prototype. This is not in any way similar to the floor pans that many people have replaced on the later models. The panel on the left of the screen is for a 3000 and all the other Austin Healeys built. The panel on the right side of the screen is the 104 prototype floor panel. You'll notice on the 3000 panel that the pattern is much different, and this particular type of panel or pattern has been used on all the replacement panels offered aftermarket for these cars. The correct panel is the one on the right with the tapered holes. This panel is not available anywhere. We had to manufacture them. It's quite a bit different. The Kilmartin panels, the AH panels are all the same as the later 3000s. What they did was they shortened the panel up and closed up the dimensions, but basically the same panel. Here is a shot of the left floor pan in the car. Still, we haven't ground it out. This is the authentic pan. It's never been taken into the car. On some of the hundreds, the floor pan where we're seeing here is generally raised just a bit to allow a bit of clearance for the spring shackle underneath that section of the floor. On this car here, that hasn't been done. This is just a flat piece of steel that was welded in to fill in the corner up to the rear upper upright for the rear bulkhead section. Looking at the rear bulkhead section, you'll notice that there are no stampings whatsoever in this panel. All the later hundreds had stampings within that area. This car just doesn't have any. Notice around the handbrake and the transmission tunnel, the recess, this too is different, and the notching is different than to what the original 100s were. Once I get the handbrake handle off, I'll explain it. One of the things that I've found interesting is that the welding is very consistent, extremely poor but consistent throughout. When we first looked at this shock plate, we had anticipated that someone had replaced the shock with some sort of an aftermarket shock, but in further examination I'm not totally convinced that this was something that wasn't done at the factory, because the shock plate welding and the welding on the adapter that they've put on there is very consistent throughout. This shot here shows a left shock plate. We can see on the inside how that plate is cracked. That was a real big problem with the Austin Healey's. That haunted them throughout their whole production era. They were just too light. The shocks were too restrictive in both motions. And this is what caused this problem. A lot of the times you'll see the holes are elongated, and a fatigued or cracked plate like this was a very common thing. Here's a shot of the left rear rebound rubber that attaches to the chassis. You can see here that it was tapered. I believe that was because of the way the chassis had tapered down, and they wanted to keep the upper part of that rubber even so that the rear end rested properly against it. The shot of the right one, you'll notice that it's welded in place. It's my intention to grind the weld off, and I'm curious to see if they were just put there as a bump stop later to be put into production, or if in fact they did bolt down. From what I can tell right now, it appears as though they were welded in place. This is a shot of the rear bulkhead in the area where the spare tire went. We can see here that the panel was bent over at some time in its life and then straightened out, and there was a piece of wood put into the back of it. I'm not convinced as that the piece of wood is authentic. I think that in actuality the section should be bent back over. In this here we can see two rivets, 3/16 rivets, that are riveted through to what they call a captured nut. On the later cars that was spot welded in. On this particular car they riveted them in. The rivets are very consistent with the same rivets that held on the shroud. I think that this again was just a test sample to see if that would simplify the installation of the rear shroud and the rear fender, and I think later these were spot welded in place and used in production. In reference to the service manual, we'll notice from this picture of a 104, in reference to the service manual, the 104 manual that I have, the printing date on it was 1959. My understanding is that the manual was originally formed around the prototype cars. In this shot here, we can see the upper steering bracket, support bracket, as having only one hole in it, one set of holes. That's the three holes that hold the steering box in place. If we look at the 100 car that we're working on, we can see here that there in fact is two sets of holes, not one, as per the life shot. If we go back and refer to the manual again on a drawn section of the same area, we can see here in the drawing they show two sets of holes. I would believe that the original information was that the two holes or the two sets of holes were there originally, but on the car that the manual was based on they did not appear, which would question as to whether or not the prototype cars were used in fact in producing the service manual. Referring to the manual, we can see here, in reference to the last comment, we can see here that there are in fact 5 screws at the front of the shroud mounting the front shroud to the superstructure. Yet on this car that we have disassembled, there were only 3. It would not appear and did not appear as though any of the holes were filled in. Clearly there are some differences, and as we go through it we'll find more, I'm sure. Another shot of the upper shock tower. Again, we can see here that You know, this is all original. It's very, very early stages of this car. One of the other things on this tower, one of the other things along this tower is on the later cars, and only the early 100s have this, or don't have this, on the outer edge of the lip there was about a half-inch lip put on the whole outside, all along here. Now that lip was added in the later models to add strength to the car. The Hunters had a habit of cracking right across and right in this section here. So that lip was introduced to help strengthen that member. One of the other things that occurred in the later cars is this section across here was welded in on the later models to help assist in the strength of the front spring tower member. As well, on the 104 we can see the area of the lower control arm. These were cut out and then welded in. In the later production cars and in the later hundreds, that was just a stamping. Because of the wall thickness of being as thin as it was, they were just stamped. If I get a chance to take a 3000 chassis apart, an original one, I'll show that and you'll be able to see the difference. That was carried on throughout the rest of the production. This is just another sample of how the car was hand built.